welcome to this episode. And I thought perhaps we can jump straight into the power of now and where we left off, and maybe this will be a slightly shorter episode today than the usual, close to an hour I've been in the last few episodes. And I'm still deciding whether to begin Eckhart's second book, The New Earth, straight after this one. I did have some thoughts of perhaps having a break or allowing time before starting it, and maybe reading through a different book. So I still haven't fully decided yet, but perhaps once I've reached the end of this reading, and perhaps an answer will arise afterwards. So we've got a couple of options there. And I'm just trying to locate where we left off. So we reached the title of Surrender in Personal Relationships. So it brings me back to the chapter where it talks about surrender. So here Eckhart is, now we're talking about surrendering in personal relationships. And it starts with a question. What about people who want to use me, manipulate or control me? Am I to surrender to them? Answer. They are cut off from being, so they unconsciously attempt to get energy and power from you. It is true that only an unconscious person will try to use or manipulate others, but it is equally true that only an unconscious person can be used and manipulated. If you resist or fight unconscious behavior in others, you become unconscious yourself. But surrender doesn't mean that you allow yourself to be used by unconscious people. Not at all. It is perfectly possible to say no firmly and clearly to a person, or to walk away from a situation and be in a state of complete inner non-resistance at the same time. When you say no to a person or a situation, let it come from a reaction. Let me read that again. Let it come not from reaction, but from insight, from a clear realization of what is right or not right for you at that moment. Let it be a non-reactive no, a high-quality no, a no that is free of all negativity and so creates no further suffering. Question. I am in a situation at work that is unpleasant. I have tried to surrender to it, but I find it impossible. A lot of resistance keeps coming up. Answer. If you cannot surrender, take action immediately. Speak up or do something to bring about a change in the situation, or remove yourself from it. Take responsibility for your life. Do not pollute your beautiful, radiant inner being, nor the earth with negativity. Do not give unhappiness in any form whatsoever a dwelling place inside you. If you cannot take action, for example, if you are in prison, then you have two choices left: resistance or surrender, bondage or inner freedom from external conditions, suffering or inner peace. Question: is non-resistance also to be practiced in the external conduct of our lives, such as non-resistance to violence, or is it something that just concerns our inner life? Answer: you only need to be concerned with the inner aspect. That is primary. Of course, that will also transform the conduct of your outer life, your relationships, and so on. Your relationships will be changed profoundly by surrender. If you can never accept what is, by implication, you will not be able to accept anybody the way they are. You will judge, criticize, label, reject, or attempt to change people. Furthermore, if you continuously make the now into a means to an end in the future, you will also make every person you encounter or relate with into a means to an end. The relationship, the human being, is then of secondary importance to you, or of no importance at all. What you can get out of the relationship is primary, be it material gain, a sense of power, physical pleasure, or some form of ego gratification. Let me illustrate how surrender can work in relationships. When you become involved in an argument or some conflict situation, perhaps with a partner or someone close to you, start by observing how defensive you become as your own position is attacked, or feel the force of your own aggression as you attack the other person's position. Observe the attachment to your views and opinions. Feel the mental, emotional energy behind your need to be right and make the other person wrong. That's the energy of the egoic mind. You make it conscious by acknowledging it, by feeling it as fully as possible. Then one day, in the middle of an argument, you will suddenly realize that you have a choice, and you may decide to drop your own reaction, just to see what happens. You surrender. I don't mean dropping the reaction just verbally by saying, "Okay, you are right," with a look on your face that says, "I am above all this childish unconsciousness." That's just displacing the resistance to another level, with the egoic mind still in charge, claiming superiority. I am speaking of letting go of the entire mental, emotional energy field inside you that was fighting for power. The ego is cunning, so you have to be very alert, very present, and totally honest with yourself to see whether you have truly relinquished your identification with a mental position, and so freed yourself from your mind. If you suddenly feel very light, clear, and deeply at peace, that is an unmistakable sign that you have truly surrendered. Then observe what happens to the other person's mental position as you no longer energize it through resistance. When identification with mental positions is out of the way, true communication begins. Question: what about non-resistance in the face of violence, aggression, and the like? Answer: non-resistance doesn't necessarily mean doing nothing. All it means is that any doing becomes non-reactive. Remember the deep wisdom underlying the practice of Eastern martial arts. Don't resist the opponent's force. Yield to overcome. Having said that, doing nothing when you are in a state of intense presence is a very powerful transformer and healer of situations and people. In Taoism, there is a term called Wu Wei, which is usually translated as actionless activity or sitting quietly doing nothing. In ancient China, this was regarded as one of the highest achievements or virtues. It is radically different from inactivity in the ordinary state of consciousness, or rather unconsciousness, which stems from fear, inertia, or indecision. The real doing nothing implies inner non-resistance and intense alertness. On the other hand, if action is required, you will no longer react from your conditioned mind, but you will respond to the situation out of your conscious presence. In that state, your mind is free of concepts, including the concept of non-violence, so who can predict what you will do? The ego believes that in your resistance lies your strength, whereas in truth, resistance cuts you off from being, the only place of true power. Resistance is weakness and fear masquerading as strength. What the ego sees as weakness is your being in its purity, innocence, and power. What it sees as strength is weakness. So the ego exists in a continuous resistance mode and plays counterfeit roles to cover up your weakness, which in truth is your power. Until there is surrender, unconscious role-playing constitutes a large part of human interaction. In surrender, you no longer need ego defenses and false masks. You become very simple, very real. That's dangerous, says the ego. You'll get hurt. You'll become vulnerable. What the ego doesn't know, of course, is that only through letting go of resistance, through becoming vulnerable, can you discover your true and essential invulnerability. If I could pronounce that right, invulnerability. And we've reached a new title, Transforming Illness into Enlightenment. And it starts with a question. If someone is seriously ill and completely accepts their condition and surrenders to the illness, would they not have given up their will to get back to health? The determination to fight the illness would not be there anymore, would it? Answer. Surrender is inner acceptance of what is, without any reservations. We are talking about your life, this instant, not the conditions or circumstances of your life, not what I call your life situation. We have spoken about this already. With regard to illness, this is what it means. Illness is part of your life situation. As such, it has a past and a future. Past and future form an uninterrupted continuum, unless the redeeming power of the now is activated through your conscious presence. As you know, Underneath the various conditions that make up your life situation, which exists in time, there is something deeper, more essential, your life, your very being in the timeless now. As there are no problems in the now, there is no illness either. The belief in a label that someone attaches to your condition keeps the condition in place, empowers it, and makes a seemingly solid reality out of a temporary imbalance. It gives it not only reality and solidity, but also a continuity in time that it did not have before. By focusing on this instant and refraining from labeling it mentally, illness is reduced to one or several of these factors: physical pain, weakness, discomfort, or disability. That is what you surrender to now. You do not surrender to the idea of illness. Allow the suffering to force you into the present moment, into a state of intense, conscious presence. Use it for enlightenment. Surrender does not transform what is, at least not directly. Surrender transforms you. When you are transformed, your whole world is transformed, because the world is only a reflection. We spoke about this earlier. If you looked in the mirror and did not like what you saw, you would have to be mad to attack the image in the mirror. That is precisely what you do when you are in a state of non-acceptance. And, of course, if you attack the image, it attacks you back. If you accept the image, no matter what it is, if you become friendly toward it, it cannot not become friendly toward you. This is how you change the world. Illness is not the problem. You are the problem, as long as the egoic mind is in control. When you are ill or disabled, do not feel that you have failed in some way. Do not feel guilty. Do not blame life for treating you unfairly, but do not blame yourself either. All that is resistance. If you have a major illness, use it for enlightenment. Anything bad that happens in your life, use it for enlightenment. Withdraw time from the illness. Do not give it any past or future. Let it force you into intense, present moment awareness, and see what happens. Become an alchemist. Transmute base metal into gold, suffering into consciousness, disaster into enlightenment. Are you seriously ill and feeling angry now about what I have just said? Then that is a clear sign that the illness has become part of your sense of self, and that you are now protecting your identity as well as protecting the illness. The condition that is labelled illness has nothing to do with who you truly are. And we've reached a new section again, and this one's titled When Disaster Strikes. As far as the still unconscious majority of the population is concerned, only a critical limit situation has the potential to crack the hard shell of the ego and force them into surrender, and so into the awakened state. A limit situation arises when, through some disaster, drastic upheaval, deep loss or suffering, your whole world is shattered and doesn't make sense anymore. It is an encounter with death, be it physical, psychological, the egoic mind, the creator of this world, collapses. Out of the ashes of the old world, a new world can then come into being. There is no guarantee, of course, that even a limit situation will do it, but the potential is always there. Some people's resistance to what is even intensifies in such a situation, and so it becomes a descent into hell. In others, there may only be partial surrender, but even that will give them a certain depth and serenity that were not there before. Parts of the ego shall break off, and this allows small amounts of the radiance and peace that lie beyond the mind to shine through. Limit situations have produced many miracles. There have been murderers on death row waiting for execution who, in the last few hours of their lives, experienced the egoless state and the deep joy and peace that come with it. The inner resistance to the situation they found themselves in became so intense as to produce unbearable suffering, and there was nowhere to run and nothing to do to escape it, not even a mind-projected future. So they were forced into complete acceptance of the unacceptable. They were forced into surrender. In this way, they were able to enter the state of grace with which comes redemption, complete release from the past. Of course, it is not really the limit situation that makes room for the miracle of grace and redemption, but the act of surrender. So whenever any kind of disaster strikes, or something goes seriously wrong, illness, disability, loss of home, or fortune, or of a socially defined identity, breakup of a close relationship, death or suffering of a loved one, or your own impending death, know that there is another side to it, that you are just one step away from something incredible, a complete alchemical transmutation of the base metal of pain and suffering into gold. That one step is called surrender. I do not mean to say that you will become happy in such a situation. You will not. But fear and pain will become transmuted into an inner peace and serenity that come from a very deep place, from the unmanifested itself. It is the peace of God which passes all understanding. Compared to that, happiness is quite a shallow thing. With this radiant peace comes the realization, not on a level of mind, but within the depth of your being, that you are indestructible, immortal. This is not a belief, it is absolute certainty that needs no external evidence or proof from some secondary source. Okay, so I'm going to end the reading at this stage, at the end of this small section. So perhaps it's good just to reflect upon what we've taken in today. And it's been a continuation on surrender, where Eckhart has gone into more specific examples and life situations, such as surrendering in a personal relationship, surrendering with illness, where you're not surrendering to the label of the illness. So in my example, I related to this in regards to depression and anxiety. And so I wasn't surrendering to, okay, this is the illness I have, but surrendering to the moment. And in this simplified moment, that is what is used to transcend the illness. So you're not using the label to say, okay, I'm going to use this disease or this illness to become enlightened, but you're going to use this moment. Eckhart's trying to convey that this all happens in the present moment, and to not give this to the mind. And he goes on to say, this doesn't mean you'll become happy. And what he's really saying is that there's a deeper, more substantial, he calls it joy, something that comes from a deeper place inside of you, that's not so unstable as happiness. And he means happiness as usually the shallowness of unhappiness is from, the conditions of an external result or something happening. But this deep joy doesn't need anything. It doesn't rely on a certain condition of your life. It doesn't rely on your partner being happy with you. It doesn't rely on you being in optimal health. And it's always available in the present moment, in that act of surrender, of accepting, of acknowledging what is in this moment. So he lists, many examples of disasters. That's another area he talks about when it comes to surrender. It could be an illness, a disability, or something. Another big event is losing your home or your fortune, where suddenly, for example, you're homeless. In a breakup of a relationship, that can be something that can be very traumatic, and we can label that as a disaster. And he says there's always another side to that, and that you are just one step away from something incredible. Because often, talking about how I handle things, when a big disaster happens, often I think to myself, there needs to be a huge shift in the other direction to offset that disaster. An equally huge, act of healing, but here is not the case. It's just one small step from transmuting, pain and suffering into gold, into consciousness, into liberation. And lastly, he talks about this is not a belief. In the mind, if this is absorbed in the mind, this will become a belief that, surrender can take away pain. But Eckhart is saying that it doesn't need external evidence. You are the evidence to yourself. You are getting the direct experience of this. This is, again, it goes back to this not being knowledge. For the mind to absorb and remember and to recall, this is almost to be digested, to be practiced, to be used. And so, just as I end this here, perhaps we can, think about disasters we've been through in our lives, whether it's small or what we label as small or big. If it's a loss of a relationship we've had, maybe a death of a person we've lost, somebody close to us. Perhaps it's to do with something in our life situation, a loss of a job. And maybe we could, imagine or remember the pain we went through with that. And if you still feel it arise in you now, is it possible to surrender to what is in this moment that has happened? This is no longer the situation it was then. In this moment you can surrender to what is now, which means you're almost releasing yourself from holding up that narrative, that story of what happened or the pain. And you're releasing yourself to what is in this moment. And that's something to be experienced. And this perhaps can be part of the practice when, the mind inevitably often brings up the past. One thing can trigger off all of the stories from what's happened. Perhaps some future relationship that, perhaps there's some pain there. Or the relationship you're in now, there's some pain there. Then it triggers off all of, the other, what we can call failed relationships. And you can feel the non-resistance. This is happening again. Why is this? Why is this pain coming up all over again with this new person? And it's just simply being aware of that pain, acknowledging it and surrendering to it. And Eckhart talks about when surrendering, there's an activity happening when you're surrendering. You are letting go, but there's an alertness there. There's an intense presence with that alertness. And that is worlds apart from just accepting the situation, accepting that you've had, these bad relationships, or accepting that the relationship you're in now is just, whatever label you want to give it. It's breaking away from all of that mind activity and stepping into the direct experience of now. And I mentioned this is not a passive action in the act of surrender. As Eckhart says, that you may be able to just do nothing, and then it almost resolves itself, or something new arises out of that. If in the middle of an argument, suddenly you realise, in this moment, you can just surrender, and then you can see what happens to the other person's energy when it doesn't have your energy to bounce off of, to help stimulate their, the energy of anger. And Eckhart says, there's also the options available there of walking away or taking action, and all of this is almost intuitive in that space of now. There's a knowing of what needs to be done. And I'm going to leave it there. Okay, so thank you for joining me for today's episode. I wish you well in this moment, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Take care.